Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined as always by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey,
Hello.
Hello, hello. Today we are discussing High Rise by J.G. Ballard, the first book in our series Bad Adaptation, Good Books Made into Bad Films. If this is your first time listening to us, you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. That link is in the episode description. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And if you'd like to support us in your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can also find in our episode description. Last week, we had a review of the book and the film. So if you're interested in that, you can find that episode in our archives. So let's talk about this book.
a lot of the response from critics to High Rise and to Ballard in general focuses on how his protagonists seem stuck. They seem unable or unwilling to take action to escape the situations they find themselves in, or they may even have created the situations themselves. It's like they are psychologically compelled towards something that seems from the outside like a disaster. This is something that Ballard himself expressed. He said that his concerns were with the psychological effects of high rise lifestyles in a 1974 interview, which was actually done when he was still writing this novel. He said, "Above all, I'd like to examine the psychological modifications which occur without the knowledge of the inhabitants themselves, to see to what degree the mind of someone who drives a car or lives in a concrete high rise has been altered." With that quote in mind, what I'd like to do is to explore some of the modifications that seem to happen to Laing, especially at the end of the book. In the novel, near the end of the book, Laing seems to become tidier and more domestic, and he's caring for his sister and Eleanor, his neighbor. And he even starts to think about returning to his medical school. In the movie, I think it's a bit different. He seems permanently changed by his experience in the high rise. He's talking in voiceover about a new family with the other residents. And it's important, I think, that in the movie, his sister is dead, which I think is quite a significant change. And it concludes with the specter of Thatcherism on the horizon via a quote warning. This is Thatcher warning us about the dangers of state capitalism. So, the difference to me between the ending of the film and the novel seems substantial, and it seems that Wheatley's ending, the director, Ben Wheatley, seems to have a different spirit. But do you think it has the same spirit as Ballard?
No, I don't. I agree. And just to clarify, his sister is dead throughout the movie. That's not something that happens in the movie.
Right. Yeah, his sister is not involved at all.
And the ending of the movie kind of makes you think that these women in the building are his sisters, right? Because they fill that void.
I yeah, I guess so.
He says that he has a new family. It's the first he's ever had, and they cut to a shot of all of the women in the penthouse.
Well, and also in the movie, all of these women are sort of represented at the end by Charlotte, right? We have Charlotte at the end, not Eleanor or his sister, because his sister doesn't exist. And I don't think Eleanor is either she's not in the movie or she's not important in the movie.
I don't think she's in the movie.
Yeah, everything is kind of condensed into Charlotte.
What do these changes mean, though, in terms of the psychological experience that Lang had? Is it different?
Yeah, so with Charlotte specifically, what we see at the end, one of the last shots, is Lang cuddling Charlotte in a kind of contented way. Whereas in the book, Lang is kind of content with what he has become and where he is going. But his position in the high rise is not a stable one. Even if he's content, especially compared to the women, he is not in a power position. the women have more or less taken over the high rise. In the movie, I don't think that's necessarily true.
For me, actually, it's unclear in both, and for different reasons. In the film, I think it's unclear how he has changed. It's very clear in one way, which is that he's achieved some kind of bliss. He's found some family that he didn't have. But the question is, like, how has he changed as a person? I don't think that there is much given to us about how he, the character in the movie, has changed as a person. Like, I think one key part of the movie is he paints his apartment, and it seems like he's settling in. That's the only instance in the film where you really get the feeling like, okay, he has all these unpacked boxes. He's unsure of where he belongs. And then he decides to paint his apartment and he's very proud of it. And he shows it off to Helen, I think. And, it's kind of symbolic of him settling into the high rise. Like there's some acceptance of this is who he is and where he belongs. Like that's the only change I see really. But it's complicated by the fact that, and this is how I understood it, that he lies to Monroe, who is not in the book, I believe. He lies to Monroe, his student, about having some kind of mass in his brain, in a brain scan, which leads to Monroe, I'm assuming, committing suicide, though it's not clear. He could have been thrown off the building. How does that fit into the overall story of the film? Like, I had a really hard time figuring out how does this fit in with his settling into the building, which is how I understood his character arc.
I think the simplest way of looking at it is that this is obviously something that is perhaps unethical to lie about somebody having a tumor that they don't really have. And perhaps according to the logic outside of the building, Lang would never have done that. But as he becomes part of the building and kind of acquiesces to the building's logic, he is willing to do that.
I can see that, but it happened so early in the film. If it had happened, midway, it would have made more sense to me. It's like one of the earliest things to happen. So it seems like Lang is the one who sets everything off. In the book, this person dying is a big deal. That's what starts him off on this downward spiral. In the film, it's less of a big deal, but I guess if you're trying to, make the two distinct, then maybe it doesn't have that effect. But it's hard for me because it's so enmeshed. This guy dying is a big part of the story.
The motivation that I see for it doesn't start with Lang, but it starts with Royal and his wife, because in the film, he is invited to this kind of 17th century costume party, and he doesn't realize it's a costume party. And he's snubbed by Royal's family, and he's snubbed by Monroe at the party. And then that seems to be the motivation for him lying to Monroe about having this tumor, is that he feels hurt by this social snub.
That's one of those instances where the movie, I think, really takes some strides where it doesn't need to. There is a scene in the book that is similar, but it's not a party that he's been invited to. It's not a dress up party. He feels snubbed in the movie, whereas there's a fear for his life in the book. And those are two very different feelings. And it feels petty in the movie, whereas in the book, it feels dire.
We talked about this, I think, in the last episode, but this is one of those instances where the movie just makes it only about class warfare
Right.
and it removes any other kind of subtlety or ambiguity, right, from that scene and from the meaning of the film.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those cases where Wheatley didn't know how to adapt the complexity of the building falling into chaos that we find in the novel. And this was his way out. And it works mechanically, but doesn't capture the spirit of the novel.
So, how do you understand the Thatcher quote?
That's what I want to get back to, actually. I want to return back to the transformation because I think it's definitely worth emphasizing because it was important to Ballard. This is his work. He writes protagonists who change in some way as a response to their environment. For me, The way I look at the change in the film is it's a transformation. There is pre high rise Lang and post high rise Lang. And in the novel, I think the experience is more a rite of passage. In the novel, we don't see him returning to his previous lifestyle, but I do think he's on a trajectory towards it. He is moving back towards who he was, whereas in the film, he does seem very comfortable with who he has become. We see this, first of all, because he's resigning himself to seeking new patients among the remaining women in the high rise, his new family, and perhaps he's forsaking his life outside of the high rise because he's not thinking about patients and people on the outside. I also think it shows that he's damaged by the experience. There is a scene near the ending where he's talking to one of his neighbors, I think Steele, and Steele invites him to have a drink, and Lang responds talking about himself in the third person. So he seems mentally ill at that point. Another thing I think that's significant is that in the book, his sister is present, and his sister is always this anchor tying him to his life outside of the high rise. Even though the relationship changes when they enter the high rise, she is an anchor to the outside world and to a continuity of time that exists outside of the building and the building's logic. And the absence of the sister as that kind of anchor to me is quite significant in the film.
You do get emotion toward it with the photo of his sister. The photo was, I think, thrown away by one of the women. It's not clear, that's the problem. They didn't really establish why the sister is important in the film outside of him not having family. So it's a very generic kind of absence.
So, I guess my question to both of you, though, is in the book and film, at the end, is Lang mentally ill?
In the film, it's pretty clear that he is, because in the film, he is compared to Steele, who's dressing up dead people, right? And having a party with them or something. And with that voiceover of him talking about himself in third person, you kind of have the comparison of the two, the juxtaposition of them being very similar, that they're both damaged in some way. In a way, it's kind of taking the perspective of a normal person. It's like you, the viewer, you are viewing these people who are damaged. Whereas in the book, I don't think it takes that perspective.
No, I think there's a transformation that happens. People have done crazy things, but they are not crazy in and of themselves. It's like a new world order, sort of. Whereas in the movie, there's a craziness that they have gone into and remained, that it's not just Steele, it's everyone.
I saw the novel and the transformation as a rite of passage very similar to you find in the beginning of Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club,
Mm.
where you have these men who are in some ways, I don't want to say emasculated because I don't know if that's really Ballard's point, but these people who are cut off from their instincts in some way by society. And they undergo this process of reclaiming those instincts. And I think that's something that happens to Lang in the novel, and I do think that it's possible after reclaiming those instincts for him to return to quote unquote normal society outside of the high rise.
Yeah, that reminds me too of another major change between the book and the movie, a change in the different characters. In the book, the treatment of Wilder, he becomes almost this kind of Neanderthal type figure at the end. He's very simple, he's childish. He keeps going on this journey to reach the top of the building. And by the time he does, he's speaking in gibberish and laughing at his recordings of his own farts and burps. And he ends up murdering Royal. But he does so in a very childish way. In the movie, it's this act of revenge. He hasn't regressed into this childhood state. In fact, we get this quote at some point in the movie. It comes from Pangborn that Lang says Wilder is the most sane person in the building. But that is a complete revision of several different events. In the book, it's a woman that says that, an unnamed woman, and it has nothing to do with this weird lobotomy idea that comes up in the movie that is never in the book. But by doing so, by siding Laing with Wilder, it does this weird thing where it both makes Wilder more than he is in the book. It makes him more heroic, but it also makes Laing much less than he is. We mentioned the women's transformation and their role, their kind of shaky role in both the film and the movie. When they end up killing Wilder at the end of the book, I see that as a culmination of New World Order. They are doing so as an act of revenge for all of the wrongdoings that have been done to them, especially by Wilder, but by all of the men in the building. In the movie, though, it feels much more like an act of revenge on behalf of the death of Royal.
No, it's for the rape of Charlotte, right? Because he rapes Charlotte, and that's the rape that is given most screen time. So when I saw the ending, I thought, oh, well, they're just avenging her. That's the whole point of this.
Now, see, because we have a speaking Wilder at the end, a Wilder that is able to enunciate and argue his points, in the movie, it just felt so much more coherent. His character felt more coherent. And because he kills Royal and then immediately gets encircled by the women, it felt like the women were part of Royal's world rather than just existing in the same level, the same area. In the book, they do encircle Wilder right after, but it felt much less connected to me, like two separate incidences. Also, Wilder goes into the circle of women willingly because he's a child at the end of the book, and he doesn't understand. It's all a game to him by that point. He goes into that circle thinking they're going to play with him. He has no clue that they're about to murder him.
So yeah, you never actually explained how you understand the Thatcher quote.
I think that the Thatcher quote is one of two touches of irony that Wheatley adds to the film that don't belong to the novel. The first touch of irony that I see is in one of the final scenes. Lang is serving Charlotte the roasted dog. And as he walks to her to offer her the food, we pan over this painting, this print behind them on the wall. The print is quite significant. It's Francisco Goya's Witch's Sabbath. It's meant to be quite indicative of Lang's persona at the moment. This is one of a series of paintings that Goya painted in secret near the end of his life on the walls of his house. And it's this very kind of chaotic image of a coven of witches standing in front of Satan. It's very dark and fearful and foreboding. The addition of that painting and this amount of screen time that it gets, to me, is meant to signify quite clearly that even though Lang feels he's very comfortable and content, he's actually not, and he is descending even further into madness. So that's a bit of irony that I think deviates from the transformation that I think is present in the novel. It's a different form of transformation. The second bit of irony that the filmmaker adds is this quote from Margaret Thatcher, where Toby is listening to the radio. And the quote is actually a recording of a 1976 parliamentary debate. Thatcher and the other members of parliament are debating government borrowing money from the IMF in order to pay for some public services. And Thatcher warns us about the dangers of state capitalism in that quotation. That, to me, I think was a very clear political gesture that's meant to say something about high rise housing because about 4 years later, her administration would actually pass the 1980 Housing Act, which gave people who were living in council estates, the public housing in the UK, the option to buy their housing from the government and actually own the flat or own the house. That to me, I think, was rather on the nose. I think it's Wheatley's way of saying that the capitalist version of housing problems that we see here in the film or in the novel look bad, but state housing could have been the answer. And state housing was destroyed by Thatcher.
Oh, it's really hard for me to draw that connection because the council houses were given to the poor. These people are actually not poor.
Right. That's the irony that I think he was reaching for. I draw the same conclusion that the people in the film and the book are not poor people. They are not living in public housing. But I think what we have to account for is if not that, why is this quotation present in the film?
I thought it was a clumsy attempt at the exclamation mark on class warfare and on capitalism. Like I said, I didn't really understand how it fit with everything because to me, it seemed like he was very clearly saying that this film is meant to be an indictment of capitalism.
It's meant to be an indictment of capitalism, but I think it's important that for especially a UK viewer hearing that voice in the recording at the end, it's not just any voice. It's a voice that represents a certain person and a certain ideology. And I think that when she talks about state capitalism, it's not capitalism in general, but a specific sort of state capitalism that I think is represented in this Housing Act, which, I don't have any personal experience of it, but according to my cursory research, what actually ended up happening is a lot of those properties ended up picked up later on by wealthy landlords and speculators. And now these properties are being sold for 5 or 6 times as much money as they used to.
It felt like a clumsy way of trying to make a statement about capitalism in general and how it kind of makes animals trapped in a zoo out of all of us. But I struggled to find any more meaning than just using Thatcher as a punching bag because it's easy to do so. She's an ardent capitalist. And if we're talking about the 1970s in the UK, it seems natural to choose her as that punching bag. But as far as trying to get a deeper meaning out of it, I didn't have one.
For me, it's just the question about ownership. Ownership is a big part of how I understand the book. And it's this idea that, the people who buy into this high rise, they are owning a part of the high rise, but they also become the high rise, like they've bought in. So that's the connection I see with Thatcher that, these people are buying into the council housing. But beyond that, any other conclusions, they feel kind of tenuous. Like we have to do a lot of research and read into that quote to make those connections. I can see it, I just don't feel very comfortable with it.
Let me ask you this because it stood out so much, because it is this voice through the media of a real person in this fictive story, it stands out in the same way that a postscript or an epigraph would stand out. And if it is meant to be a postscript or an epigraph, then it has a different sort of meaning than if it were part of the world of the story. So is this meant to be a postscript or not?
I didn't see it as diegetic. Is that what you mean? You think it could have been diegetic?
Yeah, we do see Toby listening to the radio, right? So it has this kind of veneer of, oh, here's a boy listening to the radio, but it's very clearly a snippet of audio chosen for a particular reason, placed at the end of the film for a particular reason. So I dug into it because it seems to be something that Wheatley has placed there because he wants you to dig into it. I agree that it kind of flopped, but I don't think that it flopped because it was unimportant. I think it flopped because it was done poorly.
I found a interview with Wheatley about that line. His response to the interviewer doesn't really feel like it doesn't say anything. So the interviewer asks You chose to end the film with a Thatcher quote. Did you want the film to be political? And his response is, I think you can be political without tying your flag to a party. I am a firm believer in not believing. In terms of following people, I distrust people who like to be followed. It is almost a character flaw in itself, but I think the film is certainly political in some ways, just in its sheer grumpiness and crossness. I think as a filmmaker, you always have to reflect the society around you and your own idea of what you feel has happened, even if it is not concise. All the films I've made have that point of view to a degree.
Yeah, it's the bullshit answer. I think that it probably has more meaning to me than it does to him, which is fine because that's usually the case with a lot of art.
Yeah, after hearing that response, I mean, he could have just gone and Googled a Thatcher quote, just Googled Thatcher plus capitalism, and then found the first one he liked and just plopped it in. Because, oh man, actually, I like the film less after hearing him respond in that way. Ugh.
So I want to expand on this transformation idea a little bit. We're focusing on Laing, but I want to pull it back to the rest of the building as well. One of James's favorite topics, utopias, have come up on this podcast before, but I think we get a very unique perspective on them here. There's a futurist named W. Warren Wagger. Yeah, I think is how we're saying it. And he wrote an essay called J.G. Ballard and the Transvaluation of Utopia. And his point, mostly to sum up, is that if you step outside the narrow idea of utopic writing serving as blueprints for humanity to move forward, that we actually see a very different sort of utopia emerge in High Rise, a sort of countercultural pacifism that the hero arrives at through self destruction. Transvaluation is important. It's a term that comes from Nietzsche, and it basically just means the reevaluation of something, the real evaluation of an idea. Wagger argues that the whole building goes through this transvaluation from what the characters assume is the pinnacle of modern society into an actual utopia, but they only do so after passing through hell to get there. I think we can look at the characters more individually too, particularly Laing, who survives despite the modernity and civilization of the high rise, rather than because of it. He's kind of destroyed and reborn. I think we see that at the end of the novel, that his self actualization is when he exists apart from, but also part of this new society that leaves him alone to his own devices. But I think it's not as tidy in the movie. Part of the problem with the movie is that the building itself, which is so much a realized character in the book, we get a lot of personification around it in the book. It's really only a setting in the movie. So I don't think we get a utopia there. I feel like the whole meaning of this kind of new world order that exists in the book never comes around in the movie.
I think it would be impossible for the movie to be what it is, but also have any sort of utopian message because it is so reductive and it reduces Ballard's vision to just class warfare. And because it is so ironic at the end, it would be impossible for somebody to view the movie and say, oh, this is utopia. This experience that has happened has transformed his life from a bad thing into a good thing.
So, did the movie completely miss the mark then? I mean, we're talking about bad adaptations. I feel like that is a fairly central idea for Lang's character in the book.
I think that whether or not the society inside of the high rise becomes a utopia is an open question. I don't know if I can subscribe to that view, but I think the fact that it's not an entirely negative experience the way it is in the film is quite clear to me. I think the film definitely misses the mark by making it seem like it was a negative thing and that he is permanently damaged by his experience.
Yeah, I think what Wagger is getting at is that the people who survive the brutality of the high rise, they've entered into a new world. While the high rise itself has changed in total, the people that get to benefit from the utopia that exists are only the people that exist at the end. So mostly that comes down to the women and Laing and maybe a handful of others who we don't actually see.
So is Wagger, when he's using the word utopia, is Wagger using it in the sense that we understand it, like it is a desirable world to live in?
Yes, but he's expanding on the classic idea of a utopia. As I was saying earlier, he points out that most stories about utopias, if you look at New York 2140, for example, provide this blueprint of how to get from where we are now to this perfect or near perfect world. But what Wagger is saying is that that's not what this is about. This is not showing us how to get there. This is just showing us a different sort of utopia, not necessarily someplace that we all want to live, but someplace that has a perfect logic unto itself, where the people living there are happy and content. Not that we would be happy and content.
I think where I have to disagree is you're saying that it's utopia, but not in the sense of New York 2140 or a typical utopian story where we see kind of a direction towards something from where we are towards a better state. In this novel, if we're going to consider it a utopia, we'd have to also ask, why is it necessary for these people to experience what they have experienced inside of the high rise? Why does that need to happen in order for them to enter this new state?
I guess that they can't have their perfect world without this transformation, without this gutting of itself. The people that survive are the people that either have been wronged and have formed a sort of coalition. The women specifically, at least in my reading, are the ones that rule over the high rise at the end of the book. In the movie, I don't think that's very clear. They're there, but I don't think it's clear that they are necessarily in a ruling state as much as they are a collective. I think that at least is clear. To bring it back to Laing, I think Laing has to go through it in order to discover who he wants to be. His utopia is being left alone and kind of finding this rudimentary self, this self that has returned almost to nature, but not completely.
I think I can agree with you there. Just kind of thinking spontaneously here. I think that where it might differ from a traditional utopian story is that it's not programmatic in the way that a story might be, where it's telling you this is what utopia is and this is the way that you get there. Rather, it's saying this is what utopia is for this group of people and this is how they got there. And I think one way of looking at their experience and why their experience led them towards utopia is that it's a way of exercising what we might call nowadays toxic masculinity out of their society. Because the Anthony Royal and the Richard Wilders of this world have been eliminated, those who survive are the people who have come to terms with this kind of masculine destructive energy and learn to deal with it in a pro-social way. And that may have been kind of the purifying rite or the ritual necessary to eliminate the people who couldn't handle that energy in their mental life. But just to call it utopian though, it feels too strong a word. I could admit that these people are satisfied with the way they live, but to call it utopia is perhaps an overstatement on Wagger's point.
That's where I am actually, exactly, because I take issue with the word utopia. My reading of the ending is actually, it had a very ironic tone. Did you read it that way as well?
In the book?
Yes. I did not read the book as being serious at all in the last couple of pages.
No, but do you think utopia has to be serious?
I think if you are trying to use the word utopia, there is some level of seriousness. For me, the irony of the end of the book comes from he is planning to introduce the two women, his sister and Eleanor, to morphine because he thinks it'll sway the balance of power back to him. He's afraid they might kick him out. So his way of getting power back from them is by getting them hooked on morphine. That's very dark comedy. It's not serious. Like, if you read that, you don't think, oh, well, this is a utopia. Like, at least I didn't. There's a distance between the writer and Laing. What Laing is thinking is not what the writer is trying to convey to you. The writer is trying to give you the opposite reaction. Yeah, he thinks about going to school again, and, fine. And then he once again thinks about like how he might get kicked out of the apartment by the women. And then he looks at the dog. It says, dusk had settled, and the embers of the fire glowed in the darkness. The silhouette of the large dog on the spit resembled the flying figure of a mutilated man soaring with immense energy across the night sky. And then he looks out at the high rise 400 yards away. A temporary power failure had occurred, and on the seventh floor, all the lights were out. Already, torch beams were moving about in the darkness. And skipping ahead a little bit, Lang watched them contentedly, ready to welcome them to their new world. I mean, I think you juxtapose the image of the dog with what's about to come for those other people. I mean, for me, it's very obviously ironic. I don't read that seriously. It's a utopia in that it's a very ironic utopia. Like, I don't think it's seriously a happy world.
No, but the whole point of Wagger's essay, and he points this out in a number of places, that you have to expand your definition. This is not a classical utopia. He's looking not just at high rise. In fact, he only talks about high rise briefly. He's looking at the breadth of Ballard's work, and that Ballard follows a pattern in a lot of his work where characters go through some sort of hell, and to follow Nietzsche, they go through this self destruction. That in order to reach this utopia, which is another way of looking at a self actualization, which I think Laing has at the end, that they have to pass through this hell. That's not the way most utopic writing works. And so I think what Wagger is saying is that if you broaden your definition of utopia, if you allow it to be ironic in this way, then what we do have is this new world. And it's a positive world for Laing.
I guess to me, the distinction is between the film, where he's very clearly mentally ill. In the novel, we don't look at Lang as this paragon of humanity, as like a perfect person. He's more of like a high functioning sociopath. Might be also a little bit of an overstatement, but because he's thinking about drugging his sister and Eleanor, he's not a good person. He's not the typical good person.
No, but he's very content.
I think what Ballard is saying is that the experience of living in the high rise has shown Lang that a different type of lifestyle or a different strategy towards his environment is necessary, not just inside of the high rise, but in life in general.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like he's just really stretching the word utopia here for me. Like, a utopia is just someone being happy. I know that's not what he's saying, but
Yeah, I think in most of Ballard's writing, it sounds like the transformations that happen are more on an individual level, like a group forms their own utopia out of the mess that happens in the novel. But with High Rise, the entire building is what changes. So it's a little tougher to digest. It's a little messier.
so yeah, is your reading of the end also ironic, or are you taking it at face value?
The way I see it is that Lang is able to go back to something resembling the life that he had before. He is not, in Ballard's eyes or our eyes as readers, a quote unquote good person, but he is the kind of person that his environment has made him into.
Let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk about how Ballard thinks science fiction should show us the future. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
Talking about an adaptation of Ballard's novel, I think it's worth also thinking about how Ballard looked at science fiction films in general. In a 1982 interview, when Ballard was comparing science fiction films of the past to the films of his time in 1982, like Star Wars and Alien, Ballard said, "They were masterpieces because they concretized the idea of a future. Time suddenly starts accelerating the moment those films opened. Whereas what you feel with Star Wars and movies like that is that the moment the films begin, time stops. These films exist in a kind of timeless continuum that has nothing to do with the future. It could easily be in the remote past. Also, there's no sense of continuity. Watching something like Star Wars, you don't get the feeling that this is what life is going to be like tomorrow, or for my kids, the day after tomorrow. It's a completely self contained world." It seems to me what Ballard means here, what he wants from a film, is to see a vision of a future, but also to see a roadmap that connects that future to our present. I think people could look at this negatively and say that this devalues works of pure imagination. But I think the positive spin is that this reminds us that exploration matters more when what you're exploring is yourself. So, how do you react to this?
What masterpieces is he talking about? Something like 2001?
No, not 2001. He's talking about like golden age of Hollywood, sort of 1950s science fiction. The Day the Earth Stood Still, them, the original The Thing, Forbidden Planet, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oof, Forbidden Planet? Oh, man.
So those are the movies that he does like.
So dated. Oh, man. I get what he's saying. Hearing the things that he likes sound a little bit like old man shaking his fist. But I get his point that he wants something a little bit more, not realistic necessarily, but as you put it, he can vision a way for humanity to get to that point. You mentioned The Day the Earth Stood Still. The only thing that really is outlandish there is that an alien comes down, a robot wreaks havoc on the people, and that's the future. It's not too outlandish beyond an advanced alien coming down. I think there's space to have both. I think we do get more meaning maybe from the more concrete examples. But to put it in other terms, we read some transhumanist works earlier in this podcast. And the first one was a space opera. And I think that had some things going for it. Maybe not commentary on humanity, but it had other sorts of things. It had interesting ideas that were worth exploring, even if it wasn't realistic.
I don't know if realism is the problem. I think it's that we don't see the roadmap to get from where we are to what we see in the film. I think that what he's saying is in line with the way a lot of people try to rescue science fiction from just being kind of like a kid's genre. They want to say that science fiction is important because it shows us something about ourselves and how we live and how we could live. Something like that. They try to show its real world significance.
No, I get what you mean. Yeah.
Does a film like Star Wars show you anything about how human beings live?
No,
So I guess then the question is, does it need to?
I don't think so. I think they serve completely different purposes. But I think Alien is a little bit different from that in that while it doesn't say a whole lot about humanity specifically, horror movies like that, where we have externalized this fear of a thing, in that case, this alien that is almost perfect in how predatorial it is, that there is something to that fear that can be likened to The Day the Earth Stood Still or The Thing from Outer Space.
Wait, did he cite Alien as a movie that was bad in his estimation?
Yes. He was talking first of all about Blade Runner. The interviewer asked him about Blade Runner being representative of Hong Kong, and he says, from Philip K. Dick's novel directed by an Englishman, Ridley Scott, who made Alien, a film I also disliked.
Hmm. Blade Runner, I think, has some interesting questions too related to humanity and where we're going. I see his point, especially with Star Wars, but I think he's maybe a little, and I'm biased because I really love Alien and I enjoyed Blade Runner quite a bit too, but I think he's being kind of harsh on those two, even if I understand his greater point.
I could understand if it was just Star Wars. I could understand his point because the problem with a movie like Star Wars is you don't actually need any space in the storyline. It doesn't matter. Like if you just set it in, I don't know, in ancient history or whatever, and instead of the Millennium Falcon, you have a chariot. Like the story can be the same. It doesn't really have to do with science. It doesn't really have to do with human progress. So in that way, yes, like I can get it with Star Wars. I can understand it. And with Star Trek as well. I mean, Star Trek is just a Western set in space, right? That's how they pitched it. So I can understand that aspect of it. But there's something intrinsic to science fiction that I think is present in Alien. And I think it's present in the movies he mentioned as well. So that's the one I take issue with, where I feel like Alien does have that intrinsic science fictionness. So setting aside what you're talking about, yet about like the roadmap connecting the future to the present, I'm talking about something different here.
What is this science fictionness that you're talking about?
Well, part of it is asking big questions. That's a big part of science fiction. Science fiction is about ideas. Star Wars, I would say it's not about ideas. It's a space opera, it's an epic. It's not about ideas. Like, for me, sci fi, if you set aside the fact that it's set in the future, sci fi really should be about ideas and also about the emotions that come from the interaction with those ideas.
Don't those ideas matter more when it's not just about something that theoretically could happen, but rather something that it's being argued that we're on a trajectory towards?
I feel like we're getting really close to the world of Blade Runner and that argument breaks down. I mean, AI and robots are becoming much more mainstream of a thing. I'd like to see what he thinks about newer movies like a sort of analogous movie, Ex Machina, which is sort of the same AI type of story, but feels like it has much more of that roadmap that you're talking about. We can see our present leading to that future. But I don't think that story is all that different in essence from Blade Runner, for example.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I mean, if we could resurrect him somehow to ask him what he thought about Solaris, for example. It's really hard to make a blanket statement like anything set in the future is a lesser work. Like anything set in the far future is a lesser work.
Not to defend his point, but a series like Star Wars really doesn't fit with his view because they have nothing to do with humanity. It's so far removed, not just because of guns and the Force and all of this, but that there is no meaning for humanity. There is no roadmap, like Yed was saying. There's no way for us to get from here to there. It is so different. It's not even talking about our future. In fact, it's from a galaxy far, far away.
All right, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we'll continue this series with a review of The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. We've got an updated reading schedule, which you can find on Reddit at Canonical Pod. If you'd like to talk about High Rise or other bad film adaptations, you can find us there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That really helps us grow the community. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.